So first, you'd need to have a critical mass within the system who says, let's do a deal with Trump. Second, you need the Trump administration to say, these are the people we're willing to work with. And third, they actually need to find something to agree on. So there's a lot that would need to happen for that scenario.
This is The Times at 1 with Andrew Neil, and we're getting news that a US submarine has sunk a Navy warship of the Iranian Navy somewhere in the Indian Ocean. It's off Sri Lanka's coast, so it would seem that the American reach is pretty global around that, certainly around there. And the Department of War has issued a statement in which its Secretary of State says, quote, "We've only just begun." Well, we are now into day 5 of the US-Israeli assault on Iran, and there is a new emphasis on attacking the leaders and resources of Iran's police state, with Israel taking the lead. Targets have been those responsible for internal security, including the IRGC, it's the military wing of the regime, and the Basij, it's state-sponsored thugs. Between them, they carried out most of the massacring of the protesters after the recent demonstrations. Now their facilities and leadership are being degraded. The IRGC's Tharhala HQ has been hit, some of its top generals killed. And the HQ of the police special units, that's in Faraja, which organise riot control and confront civil unrest, has also been attacked, killing the head of intelligence. The strategy seems to be Israel and the US will do the airstrikes from above, the Iranian people would need to do the rest from below. But not yet. Yesterday, President Trump told potential protesters it was still too dangerous to take to the streets because there were a lot more airstrikes to come. Now, Naysan Rafati is a senior analyst on Iran at the Crisis Group. It's an independent non-profit organisation dedicated to preventing wars. Let me just ask you straight out on this, Naysan Rafati. Can this work? Can a police state be degraded enough from the air to give the protesters on the ground a fighting chance this time?
Hi, Andrew. It's good to be with you. As you said, in January, we had major protests across Iran that showed a very real degree of discontent against the Iranian system. And in terms of the US and Israeli strikes that we've seen over the past few days, they're really focused on 3 things. They're focused against the regime's head, including the supreme leader himself, its muscles, its ability to fire missiles and drones and develop munitions, and its heart, including those IRGC and Basij facilities that you just mentioned. But for this to work, 3 things need to happen. There has to be mobilization from below, which is hard to do when you're actively under fire, as President Trump alluded to. There has to be a sufficient kind of blunting of the coercive apparatus, which still retains guns and it still retains personnel who, more than they have ever in the past, see it as a fight for their lives. And for the moment, the balance is still tipped in the state's favor, but over time, it will lose capacity and perhaps increase desperation.
Well, if the degradation continues from the air, and these are clandestine matters, so we can't be sure, but there could easily come a time, if it already hasn't happened, in which Mossad, the CIA, and perhaps soon special forces are actually operating on the ground to further the destabilization from the air.
It's entirely possible. As you said, these are things that will probably become clear over the course of time rather than in real time. We know that the Israelis certainly have a ground presence. We saw that in June, and we know that the Iranians have a lot of intelligence penetration across their system. So yes, there's certainly a possibility that either right now or down the line, there could be a acknowledgement that air power alone can't change facts on the ground, and that there may be some element of pushing that process along.
The regime's clearly taking a thumping, both in terms of its leadership and of its resources. But can we detect yet, and I know it's difficult because it's not easy to find out what's actually happening in the country, but can we detect in any way any sign of a coherent opposition forming?
Well, I think that, Secretary of State Rubio gave testimony in late January, and he said, I think, what is the only real answer to this question, which is that we don't know what would follow this regime. We don't know right now. The system's primary priority is having coherence at the top of the system. They've lost the man who was in charge of the Islamic Republic for nearly 4 decades, and they're trying to show that there's continuity in command and control. You have, on the one hand, President Trump raising this idea of a Maduro model, saying that, if there is someone from within the system who is willing to work with the U.S., that would be something that he's not opposed to. Or elements from outside the system. The challenge is for them to first organize, then mobilize, and then be able to challenge the system itself.
Well, that is the choice when you've got Donald Trump in the White House, isn't it? Is there a coherent opposition forming? Hard to tell. Or if the pain and death being inflicted on the regime is sufficient, that there is a faction or factions within the regime that might think, as the deputy dictator of Venezuela decided, let's see if we can do a deal with Donald Trump. That's a possibility, I guess.
Everything is a possibility at this stage, but what would need to happen for that scenario is that first, and we've seen reporting today that there's been some indirect intelligence to intelligence contacts between the U.S. and Iran. I don't know how substantial those reports are. But right now within the system in Iran, and as you mentioned quite rightly, it's very difficult to get a sense of what's happening, not just on the ground in Iran, because there's an information blackout, but especially within a system that is right now probably in a state of paranoia and quite literally bunkered down. So first, you'd need to have a critical mass within the system who says, let's do a deal with Trump. Second, you need the Trump administration to say, these are the people we're willing to work with. And third, they actually need to find something to agree on. So there's a lot that would need to happen for that scenario. And we know that in Venezuela, a lot of the work was done in advance. We know that the contact with Maduro's inner circles were conducted before the start of the operation to take him out of the country.
How serious is for the regime, of the risk of a Kurdish uprising in the West, where I see there's even talk of a possible ground operation, not involving Israel or America, but a ground operation there? That would be a cause for concern in Tehran, I would have thought.
Well, I think over the last few days, there's been a churn of reporting about, first of all, President Trump talking to some Kurdish leaders, and then potential liaising between U.S. and or Israeli intelligence and some of the Kurdish groups on the ground. I think for Tehran, this is in many ways a curse, and in some strange ways, a potential blessing. The curse is that if these reports bear out and we do see some kind of mobilization of anti-regime Kurdish forces supported by the US or Israel, then it makes the system in Iran have to deal with that on the ground, right? It would need the dispatch of IRGC forces or army forces at a time when it's dealing with, ongoing aerial bombardment and potential unrest from below. So it's a distraction. On the other hand, I think that the system might use anything that has a whiff of separatism or civil unrest to say, you see, even if you don't like us as a regime, the Americans and the Israelis are trying to, destabilize the country. And I think that the gambit for them there would be that, even if a lot of Iranians are against the system itself, that notion of seeing Iran's territorial integrity potentially compromised, again, if any of these reports are accurate, is something that the regime will very quickly, thump on to say, you need to rally around us because the alternative is bad for the nation as a whole.
Naysan Rafati, thank you for joining me on Times Radio today.